Young children typically don't understand death at all. For preschoolers, death is a temporary and magical thing. It's really unpredictable and dramatic. It isn't until they get to like kindergarten, first grade, between the ages of about 5 to 7, that they begin to understand the permanence of death and that it will happen to everyone. And it means the body will no longer function at that point. So if you think back to Piaget's model of how, children develop cognitively, this reflects a shift to a more concrete, operational kind of thought. But you've probably already noticed that little kids just don't seem to understand it. Like if you have had your own children, or if you think back to your own childhood, maybe you had a pet that died. Parents sometimes will try to explain to the child what happened, but it's also very common for parents just to try to sidestep the issue because they have found and they understand at some level that they can't explain this. No explanation will make sense to a preschooler. It's just inherently incomprehensible to them. They don't really start to develop any capacity to understand death until between about the ages of 5 to 7, like I said, and as they grow older, that understanding becomes a lot more nuanced. Now, by the time a person reaches adolescence, that's typically, when most people do experience a death in the family or a death of one of their friends. 40 to 70% of people will experience a loss of a family member during their high school or college years. And that first experience of death tends to be particularly difficult, and its effects are severe. The grieving is severe, especially if the death has a short trajectory, if it's unexpected. So the consequences you can see from this first experience of death involve chronic illness, lingering guilt, low self-esteem, poor job and school performance, substance abuse, relationship problems, and suicidal ideation. But by the time the person reaches adulthood, they've largely come to terms with the concept of death. But if they see the death in another young adult, that's kind of hard to process. When you're in your young adult years, you are at your physical prime. So when somebody dies, it's highly unexpected. In many ways, the person feels like that person who died was cheated out of their future. And this can be especially difficult, like emotionally, if that person that died was a partner. Losing a partner in young adulthood is very difficult because of how unexpected it is, and that grief can last between 5 to 10 years in most cases. But as you grow older and as you reach middle adulthood, you're just going to become a little bit more capable of dealing with it. Of course, it's still going to have a powerful negative impact. Like losing a spouse in middle adulthood will make you challenge a lot of basic assumptions about your life, but you'll be more capable of dealing with the grief at that point. One particular kind of loss, though, that nobody can really prepare for is the death of your child. Losing a child in young adulthood tends to result in the most intense mourning. Some young adults, they'll never recover from that. That losing a child at that point in their life is so unexpected and so traumatic that it affects them for the rest of their life. It could end the marriage. It could end the relationship entirely. It could result in the person just not caring about being successful at work or in school anymore. It can, in many ways, ruin an individual's life to have to go through that kind of experience. And unfortunately, a lot of people do have to go through that experience. Young parents are the ones who most likely have to deal with SIDS. That's called sudden infant death syndrome. It's the death of an infant for oftentimes unknown reasons. And parents who have to experience this, they typically report a much higher level of anxiety in general. Like they might in fact develop anxiety disorders and become a lot more pessimistic, just have like a negative view of the world and themselves, and they'll feel a lot of guilt. So we'll see a lot of dramatic personality shifts as well. Like a happy, bubbly person could turn a complete 180 as a result of this kind of experience. And while it is unfortunately, relatively common to lose a child during childbirth, that still does happen. The trauma that the individual, like the mother and the father as well to a degree, will experience can be incredibly strong, because that experience of childbirth is one of profound bonding. Like you develop a very strong attachment when you see that individual born. But if the individual is not alive when born, if they're stillborn, then that strong bonding is twisted and results in this incredibly deep, depression. But in general, our society just doesn't seem to understand how powerfully negative that experience can be, and people expect that, individual who is almost going to be a mother, they expect her to recover quickly and get back into society. But if the children survive and they move into like young childhood and teenage years and die at that point, that can also be profoundly disturbing, it can produce an intense amount of grief as well. But when you're middle-aged and you lose a child like that, while it can be devastating and it can have a profound negative impact on any surviving siblings and the spouse and things like that, it is typically something that an individual will be able to recover from more effectively. While the grief can last as long as 13 years, it is something that a person can recover from to a certain degree. Now, the kind of death that most people are somewhat prepared to deal with, at least, by the time they reach adulthood, is the death of their parents. Regardless of age, however, when a parent dies, that loss is going to, of course, hurt them. Even if they don't have particularly good relationship with the parent, the loss of a parent manifests as like the loss of like a buffer between that individual and death. So typically, like the way you could think about this is like the child sees the parent as their future self in some regard. Like when a child looks to their parent, they can see themselves growing older. They can see themselves becoming, that individual. But when that individual dies, now they have nothing to look forward to. Do you see what I'm saying? Like they've lost that kind of buffer. It's like they're next in line, basically. But in a more physical sense, the death of a parent is going to result in the loss of somebody who could support you, who could provide you with guidance and advice. And that loss is likely going to result in some complicated form of grief that involves, a lot of relief potentially if the relationship wasn't very, positive, but also a lot of guilt and potentially like freedom. Like people's relationships with their parents tend to be a pretty mixed bag. While you might love them deeply, when they do pass on, now they won't be able to restrain you in ways that they may have done in the past. So yeah, it's definitely a mixed bag when somebody suffers the death of a parent, but typically the result is a pretty profoundly negative experience. And for a lot of individuals, the trajectory for their parents' death isn't very steep. They can see the parent's death coming and they can prepare for it. But if the parent is suffering from a disease like Alzheimer's, for example, Alzheimer's is something I talked about in a previous video. It's a common disease of old age where the person starts to develop a kind of dementia where they progressively lose the ability to just understand the world and control themselves. So if you see your parents go through that before they die, in a manner of speaking, it's kind of like you get to watch your parent die twice. Like first they die to Alzheimer's, and then their life actually ends later. So it's kind of a sad thing to think about, but yeah, watching a parent go through Alzheimer's is like watching somebody die slowly, basically. Now, once you've reached late at life, once you've reached the elder years, as I've previously discussed, you typically have less death anxiety. You're going to be less upset about your own death and the death of others. You're just better able at dealing with it. And this is typically because when an elder dies, we assume that they've lived a good life. They had a chance. They perhaps accomplished all the goals they set out to. So it's not something we should be very upset about. They weren't cheated out of anything. They had a chance. And another reason why elders typically are better at dealing with death is because they've seen it before, perhaps many times, and they've developed coping mechanisms that are effective for them. But there is one kind of death that elders typically can't handle too well, and that's the death of their child or grandchild in late life. The reasoning behind this is basically that, like I was saying before, when a parent dies, that's expected. It's like they're in front of you in line. But when the child dies before the parent, or when the grandchild dies before the grandparent, that expectation is violated, and the person is, in a manner of speaking, confused by this occurrence. It's not how things are supposed to happen. And as a result of this shock and confusion, these bereaved parents will often feel guilty about their pain and about losing their child, and how that loss and how that pain affects the relationship with surviving children. And many grieving parents will talk about this loss as though it was the most important relationship they had. But grandparents tend to have it the worst. The grandparents, they feel this deep sense of loss. They have a lot of guilt as a result, and they don't want to put those feelings on to the parents of the child, their children. So they will often hide their grief in an attempt to shield them from even more pain. But thankfully, that kind of loss, like I said, it's unexpected. It doesn't occur that often. Something that will always occur, though, if you are in a relationship with somebody long enough, if you get married to somebody and you stay married to them, it's right there in the vows, till death do you part. So everybody, if you get married like that, you're going to have that experience at some point. And while it can be fundamentally disabling in a manner of speaking, our society doesn't really expect people to take that long to recover. U.S. society expects people to mourn briefly, but the grief can usually take many years to resolve. Now, how quickly that grief resolves, how quickly they can, recover from the loss of a spouse in late life, depends strongly on the quality of the relationship with that person before they died. Because what the person's going to be doing following the death is they're going to be reflecting on that relationship. And if they have a lot of positive memories, then it's going to just make them even more remorseful, even more despondent. In a manner of speaking, it would be a lot easier for the surviving spouse if the relationship was not a good one.